Hi everybody, my name is Pete. Welcome to Wingman Studios. We are going to continue talking about audio fallacies that held me back, cost me money, made me stuck. And today we're going to be talking about audio cables don't make a difference. That's the fallacy that I want to address. Audio cables do make a difference. And I will also include AC cables in this. We can discuss a little bit about USB cables and the cables that actually connect, let's say, interfaces to computers, things of that nature. AC cables is a source of high audio quality, both in high current drawing equipment in the studio, as well as guitar rigs. And I've had experience with that. Bass rigs and PA systems. And so we'll discuss that more towards the end. Cables are the vascular system of your recording studio. Think of it like the vascular system of a human being. It transports fuel, transports oxygen, and if your vascular system isn't running properly, you got problems, sometimes causing heart attacks. We don't, of course, experience that in audio gear necessarily, but the gear will not be running optimally if the vascular system, the cabling, isn't running right, or we've chosen to use a cheaper cable. So cables are, again, the vascular system, and this includes your playing rig. So if you're playing live, guitar rigs, bass rigs, those types of things, PA systems, and of course, recording studios. So what we're going to do is we're going to get right into it. We're going to steel man the statements around audio cables. In no particular order, there are a lot of cheap alternatives. This is number one. There's a lot of cheap alternatives when it comes to cables on the market. And this ultimately infers that people are buying these. Therefore, there can't be much difference in the cables. If people are just buying cheap cables, there can't be a difference. All of these people are basically keeping the cheap cable companies in business, and they can't be wrong. Well, of course, if we know anything about our fallacies, we talked about this in even the other two videos, that this is the fallacy of bandwagoning. What does that mean? Well, everybody's doing it, so therefore it must be all right. Maybe for some people, again, cheap cables will work, but let's discuss this further as we get into this. The second steel man is if you make a decision to make the purchase easier, it'll be easier on your pocketbook ultimately, and that decision will give you a dopamine hit. And I can tell you, everybody loves to save a few bucks. So how am I steel manning that part of the statement or this idea that would lead us to that fallacy statement? If you can buy something for cheaper and still get the same quality, still get the same performance, of course, it's a dopamine hit. One of the reasons why we love to buy used gear is that maybe somebody's offloading it, right? We know it's a great piece of equipment and they just, maybe need money quicker. And so the point is, you might get a good deal. Feels good. It feels really good to know that, hey, we saved a couple of bucks. But we'll discuss how that doesn't necessarily translate to better audio. So let's go to the next one, number 3. Most cables look the same, therefore they are the same. And this is a fallacy based on ignorance. A person doesn't know what they don't know. So in other words, just because something looks a certain way doesn't mean that it is going to perform the way either A, that you had hoped, or B, the way that the manufacturer said it would perform, or C, in comparison to something that is much better, higher quality. You're going to see that there's a difference there. Let's go to the next one. A cable is not a complicated piece of equipment, therefore it shouldn't cost much to manufacture. This again is a fallacy based on ignorance. Unless you do the numbers and look at all the details and the components and the parts that make up a cable, not including the engineering of the actual cable itself, there's a lot of expense here. Okay, depending on what you're using. And if you want something of higher quality, which is another attribute of a higher priced cable, these, this element, just because it looks the same, again, is not a one-to-one translation in terms of audio quality. We're going to discuss that more. Another steel man, based upon other comments that support the idea that cables don't make a difference, is number 5. It doesn't make sense to spend a lot of money on a cable when a cheap one passes audio through just the same. So this is something that people will say. And it is true that all cables have an associated function, right? They will pass signal, a type of signal through the cable. The question is, do we get a facsimile of audio from the source to the destination? Do we lose something in the process of that transmission? Do we lose something in the process of the translation? Let's go to number 6. All oxygen-free cable is the same. This is the fallacy of lumping things together because they share the same family and they share the same properties. All right, it's not true. Not all oxygen-free copper is the same. You can't tell the difference, number 7. You can't tell the difference in sound between high-end cables versus cheap cables. Okay, and then they'll add this in there, especially in short runs. In other words, don't worry about the cable quality in a short run. Now, this sets the standard based upon people who can't hear, who maybe don't care, people who don't want to know how to hear, or maybe they just don't know how to hear. And all of a sudden now we're setting a standard based upon another person's inability. That to me doesn't sound too wise, but let's go to the next statement. Number 8, people will say in support of, hey, cables don't make a difference. I don't mind cheap cables. I just throw them away and replace them because they're so cheap. You know, so in other words, when it breaks, when you actually no sound goes through them anymore, I'll just toss them. I'll just throw them away. And this assumes that the cable transmits fine. In other words, that the cable is actually working properly, or maybe you're assuming that it's working with high quality. In other words, the transmission is a facsimile from one end to the other. The only issue is the craftsmanship of the cable. And of course, when you have poor craftsmanship, we can deduce that there's a good chance that the longevity in terms of use of the cable might have a short life, okay? Wrapping it up, moving it around, plugging it in, these types of things. Live applications, it's more critical, of course, to have a cable that's well manufactured because they do get moved, they do get dropped, all of these things. You're wrapping them up. There's lots of things that can be stepped on, ran over, whatever. There's a lot of things that a cable will go through in its life. So let's start responding to those statements now that support, or the steelman basically, of these, those steelman statements that basically support the initial statement that cables don't make a difference. So let's take a look at number 1 again. The first one, there are a lot of cheap alternative cables on the market. This infers that people are buying these. Okay, and therefore, if those companies are in business, there must be something to this, right? So we're going to go ahead and move on that and purchase cheap cables. Well, here's a thought. Number 1 really just falls under that bandwagon fallacy, and it must be good if everyone is doing it. One reason there are a lot of cheap cables on the market is because cheap cables are what? Cheap, right? So this goes back to the dopamine fix that, hey, I was able to buy something less expensive that theoretically does the same job, okay? And so, you feel good about saving money in the process. And ultimately, cheap cables, to make a higher potential in profit margin, they don't necessarily rely on the markup of the cable. They just rely on people buying it over and over and over again. They know the cable's going to break. So therefore, they're going to have to purchase it, which kind of goes back to number 8 that we just discussed a little bit, where, hey, once it breaks, I'll just get another one. Kind of a throwaway mindset, and we'll just toss it away. There's some issues with that. I just want to add this real quick. If you know that the longevity of that cable isn't going to be very good, I don't know if you know how many variables you're adding to the equation in your live performances or even in the studio for that thing to fail. If that thing fails and you can't figure out what's going on, that wastes you time, that wastes you money, especially if you're working with a client. If you're at a gig and they're expecting you to play and to be on time and to not be down because you can't figure out what's going on with your rig because you have failing cables, that is not a good place to be. So let's take a look at number 2 again over here. If you make a decision to make the purchase easier on your pocketbook, that decision will give you a dopamine hit. Okay, let's discuss that. So this goes back to the idea of buy once, cry once, ultimately. I stand behind that statement. I believe that if you buy properly the first time, that thing's going to last you. And then that's another variable that you don't have to think about. You don't have to be concerned about that part of your rig, that part of your studio failing or not performing as you hope, or maybe that you think it's performing, and maybe it's performing less than that. So what's interesting is that the dopamine rush you ultimately get from saving money, never translates to the audio quality it should provide. See, what happens is we're making an association here. I saved money. Therefore, I feel good about that. Therefore, I'm happy with that being in my studio or in my guitar rig. The trouble is, that's not a one-to-one not a comparison, but that's not a one-to-one translation in quality. That has nothing to do with the audio quality, all right? All it says is that you saved money. That's all it says, okay? You could get a cable for a great quality or at a discount, and this is good. This kind of gets you closer. So let's say there was a sale on cables or something, and you find the exact same type of cable, and it's just a lot cheaper. Sometimes you'll find resources online where you can actually get great cables for not that expensive, or not as expensive. So this is a closer one-to-one translation. I agree that we all have to start somewhere when it comes to our equipment purchases, our cable purchases. Some people do not need high-quality cables, and this is true too. Sometimes it doesn't, for a person who's really not gigging, they're just a hobbyist, they're not really doing much, maybe they could get away with not having a more expensive cable. Somewhere down the line, I think as they grow in their music, as their ear sort of improves and how they hear things, I think eventually they're going to throw those cheap cables away and they're going to end up buying something of a higher quality. So if you're interested, if your interest is to have the highest quality possible in your performing rig, pedal boards, recording studios, PA systems, alleviate the variables associated with the cheap cables ultimately, because this will save yourself time. Right? Time meaning in critical time too, especially if you're dealing with a time sensitive situation, like you've got a live gig and everything needs to be running and that downbeat needs to be at a certain time and you can't because something's failed or cable has failed and you can't figure it out. There's that part. Maybe it's your guitar rig, same situation. Maybe it's in the studio, you got a client, you're trying to plug things in, you thought everything was working, all of a sudden something is not transmitting right and you got a problem, you're trying to figure it out. All of that wastes time. It also makes you look bad, okay, in the process. So your good name, your reliability, who you are as a service provider, right? Because that's, as musicians, that's kind of what we are, begins to go out the window, because of the fact that we couldn't figure out where our limitations were with our cables. Something as simple as that. Let's go to the next one, number 3. Most cables look the same, therefore they are the same, all right? So the quality of a product goes way beyond its look. A quality product will feel more well-built, offering sturdiness and performance to match. That's in most cases. You might have cables where that doesn't happen, but if you have a high-quality cable and that cable company has got their name on it, they don't want junk going out. Why? Because people are going to send that junk back. And especially if there's a warranty guarantee on those cables, which usually high quality cables do. Many of them have like lifetime warranties and these types of things. So you're getting something worthwhile. What type of copper or silver that's used as conductors and how the cable is braided and insulated also makes a huge difference. These are things you can't see from the outside. All right. So in other words, if they look the same, doesn't mean that they are the same. You're going to have a difference in transmission. You're going to have a difference in maybe RF crosstalk and grounding issues and any other type of noise anomalies. Unwanted noise will impede, hear me clearly now, will impede the sense of space, clarity of audio transferred through that cable. This might seem like a nuance, but if you study anything that Rupert Neve speaks about, which is the godfather of recording, and of course he is an advocate for high fidelity audio, He basically makes it very clear that when these higher frequencies get impeded, it affects the entire sound and our perception of the sound. Even the low frequencies will seem different because of the either the lack of having proper high frequency, and we'll talk about how this can also be altered by timing issues. And so we'll discuss that too as well. Let's take a look at number 4. A cable is not a complicated piece of equipment, therefore it shouldn't cost much to manufacture. The statement is true if you're manufacturing cheap cables. All right, that's true. In higher end cables, there is engineering detail. All right, so when you talk about engineering, a manufacturer has to pay somebody to engineer the product if they're really serious about getting the highest quality possible and making sure that this thing's going to work like it's going to be, like it's going to be advertised, okay? So there's a lot involved in that. So you want to make sure that this engineering detail is there, manufacturing detail, in other words, that it can withstand the moving and the plugging in and the unplugging and the dropping and all of the things that go with it. And of course, the performance detail, in other words, how it transmits the information. All of these things are majorly important to a good cable company because their name is on it. Their name is on it. And their name, I'm sure, to them is the world. It's the stamp, it's the brand, it's the trust, stamp of approval. The reputation is literally stamped either on the cable or on the packaging of the cable. Trust that a product performs as advertised is imperative for customers to purchase products with confidence. I would like to purchase my products with confidence. I know you would as well. And my encouragement is to really reduce variables when it comes to our ability to make music. Because the more variables there are and the more headaches there are, the harder it is to do that. Let's go to number 5. So it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of money on a cable when a cheap cable or cheap one passes audio through just the same. All right, let's take a look at that one. So, number 5, it is true that copper will conduct a signal. I think we can all agree to that. Cheap copper has a higher capacitance. Higher capacitance copper will trap the high frequency sounds in the insulation, not allowing the frequency to come through properly. This messes with sibilance, space, transients, stereo imaging, timing that will relate back to phase issues, potentially, hearing early reflections, all of these things. High capacitance can slow down voltage movement and distort the signal or pulse, even if it's a digital signal, that finally reaches the circuitry. This will impede your high frequency, the low frequency balance that impairs the punch of the track, your overall perception of the low end. All audio passing through a cheap cable is going to be degraded in some capacity. Now, microphone and passive instruments will suffer the most with this. They will suffer the most. A very low signal comes from a microphone and from a passive instrument. This is why we have to have preamps, because preamps have to boost that very low signal to get it up to a point where it's usable. If you got noise in there, or if you're lacking the overall signal, in other words, you're not getting a true facsimile of the signal. In other words, what's coming out of that mic, what's coming out of that instrument, or even maybe in line level at times as well. In line level will be affected as well. The point is that if you're not getting a true facsimile of that a signal, okay, we've already lost. We've lost before we started. You see? This is the problem with that. So let's go to the next one here. Going off of notes, trying to stay on course. Number 6 says this: all oxygen-free copper is the same. Well, that's not true. There are 3 different types of copper. Oxygen-free copper. Plus, winding design and manufacturing also makes a difference in the quality of the audio passing through it. How it passes through. Do you get a facsimile on the other side? In other words, do you get the closest representation on the other side? And again, this doesn't take into consideration copper. That is not oxygen free. Okay, let's say if there's cables that are being made without that. So there is a difference. Let's go to number 7. You can't tell the difference in sound between high-end cables versus cheap cables. All right. Number 7 here, you can tell the difference in cables if you know what you're listening for. You can. Many people are listening to just the obvious tone. They're associating to the low-hanging fruit when it comes to the actual audio that they're hearing. Okay? For some people, this doesn't make a hill of beans difference. But if you're a studio, let's say owner, or you're moving into these areas, or you're trying to get the best product possible for your client, or you're wondering why I'm not getting the sound that I'm hoping for, or why it's very difficult to get the sound, cables might be a part of this equation. So people might be just listening to the obvious tone, identifying signals, or volume of the sound. In other words, they're just hearing the basic thing, and they're not really thinking about what they're hearing. There are nuances that make the sound what it is, including harmonic overtones, direct tone, strength of the tone, phase relationship of the tone, even in a single instrument. Short runs of cheap cable, okay, will still degrade the signal. It'll be less because it's shorter, but at the same time, it still does. Longer runs, in my humble opinion, you're just asking for trouble. And there could be a myriad of different types of noise that's causing a problem. Maybe stuff that's directly audible, or there's things that, again, are just, because of capacitance issues, are not causing the signal from whatever you're recording from microphone, line level, or line level type of, or passive, I should say, passive instruments, as well as microphone signals coming through that could potentially have a lot of problems if you don't have a good cable there. One example I want to give real quickly is within the studio, what I tried to do, this was a while back, I tried to, on the cheap, okay, so confession, on the cheap, I wanted my dopamine hit. What I did was I tried to wire up a patch bay, and I thought, well, you know what I'm going to do is I'm just going to order bulk cable, and I ordered a bunch of cheap bulk cable, and I ordered connectors and things of that nature, and I said, well, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to do balanced cabling here, and everything's going to be cool, and so I went ahead with that, and I thought, well, this is going to be really convenient for me because A, it's cheaper, right? I spent a lot of hours doing all the wiring because I made all the wiring myself. I mean, I know how to solder and things. So I did all of that. And one of the things that the studio did have prior to that addition of the patch bay, the wiring was Mogami, okay? Everything was Mogami. And so when I brought this other piece in, and the way that I kind of wanted to have it connected for my convenience so that I can plug things in and out and things of that nature, right away, there was a difference. Right away. You could hear it in the space. You could hear it in the definition of the instruments. You could hear it. And I wouldn't have heard it if I would have just wired it up and put it in, but I hadn't had the higher quality prior. I thought I could just sort of put it in and the cheap and the good could work together. I thought, hey, this is the answer. No. I wasted, and it wasn't just me that heard it too. I had other people come in and listen. We did A/B comparisons, and they heard it as well. And so I'm like, oh man, what a waste of time and what a waste of money. So I've got a few spools of cable if anybody wants to buy some cable. I'm kidding. But I still have spools of cable, and these other cables, they're just sort of sitting. I'm not going to use them. Okay. So that's kind of what happened there. So, and these cable runs as well were not long cable runs. These cable runs were less than 20 feet. And so that is kind of proof in the pudding that, well, cheaper cables, as long as they're short, you're going to be okay. That is not what happened here. All right, let's go to the next one. I don't mind cheap cables. This is number 8, the last one. I don't mind cheap cables. I just throw them away, and replace them when they go bad. All right. All right, so let's talk about that. So cheap cables are easy to throw away. Yes, they are. Why? Because I throw all my cheap cables away. In fact, I love throwing away cheap cables. Why do I love throwing away cheap cables? Because I don't want cheap cables integrating with my good cables and then me grabbing one because I'm trying to save money because I really should have replaced that cable a long time ago. All of that commingling, I had to get that all fixed, okay? Get rid of all the bad or cheap cables, make sure that we're only using the proper cables. Removing cheap cables from my rig or cable choices and using high quality cable does this. It ensures the highest quality audio transmission between components, instruments, and microphones. Now think about that. Think about that. That's like an insurance policy. That's like what out of the probably thousands of variables that you can experience in a studio, that's one less thing to worry about. And if you have an analog studio, you have a lot of cables. There's a lot of cables to go bad here, all right? You don't want cables going bad. You don't want cables malfunctioning and not transmitting properly. You want all of those cables to be noise-free, free-flowing, low capacitance cables, very low capacitance. Mogamis are very low capacitance. I talk about them because I use them. And I think they're great cables. There are probably others out there too that are really, really good. I just sort of gravitate toward those. So again, we use Mogamis. All it takes, again, is one failure, one malfunction to completely shut down a recording session. Playing performance with your guitar rig, bass rig, keyboard rig, etc. PA performance, right? Imagine trying to do a killer solo and all of a sudden, you turn one direction and your guitar goes dead because you got a cheap cable. You're hitting your pedal board and you actually hit, you maybe just bump one of them and it's still plugged in, but it stops working. There's no time for that. We don't have time for that. If you're a professional player, you do not have time for that. If you're in the studio, it's all the same type of thing. PA performance, I've done tons of live jobs with PAs. That was always the nightmare, is if you had cables failing and you weren't keeping up with it. That's the last thing you need. You need to be able to plug in everything, get everything set where it needs to be, and you need to go without fail. You need to be able to move forward with great confidence. So trust me when I say you don't have time to again mess with cables, spending valuable time and time trying to troubleshoot. Theoretically, you could be losing a job here if your cables aren't running right. All right, because nobody wants to mess with you if you're back there dinking around with your rig and the gig's already going and you're not playing, right? So that's not a good thing. So again, the amount of variables that can go wrong within all of these examples are very high. It's imperative to control the controllables, to reduce stress and have the most fun. That's really what this is about. We talked about that even in our first video. All of this is to have a wonderful time, a great experience, and just having the insurance policy that, hey, the cable's going to work all the time, or, you're not going to really have to worry about it, is a great insurance policy. So negative variables. Now, this is an interesting point. We're coming to the end. Negative variables compound negatively in any situation. Studio situation is what we're talking about. Gig situation was what we're talking about. Live PA situation is what we're talking about. Negative variables compound negatively. All right? So, in other words, if you have, like in the studio, let's say there are 100 cables in here, and let's say 20 of the cables are questionable. Well, I am getting 20 different cables that are possibly affecting the audio in a negative way. Okay? So let's say that the degradation is 10% on all of those cables. Or on each cable. Let's say it's 10% on each cable. All right, so 10 and there's 20 cables. That's 200. That's like 200% in that area of my studio is not optimally running properly. Right? It's compounding. And this is the one thing that most people don't think about because they think of just one cable and, well, this one cable, it's cheap, whatever, it doesn't matter, there's no compounding, it's just one cable. Well, when you have multiple cables, if you have a pedal board, if you have, your cable going to your, from maybe your guitar to your rig and any other type of connection that might be going on. When you're talking about a studio, when you're talking about live, especially live, and I say that, live PA is what I mean. Live PA, those cables are always being moved. They're always being schlepped around and moved and dropped and all of these things. You do not want your cables failing, all right? You want to have that insurance policy. And the other part of it is that if you have, let's say, half of your cable collection has got problems, that's a lot of variables. That's a lot of negative compounding happening in your audio potentially. So reducing variables positively will compound positively. So this is sort of the opposite way of thinking here. So in other words, let's say what you had was still 10% degradation. There was some issue. Something was not right with that cable. And then what ends up happening is you increase that by getting a high quality cable. Maybe you increase it by 10%. You've got 20 cables. That's a 200% increase in that area of your studio. All right? In that area. And that's the other thing you got to remember. It's going to be in that area. It could be incredibly profound in terms of what you hear. Like when I added when I tried to, do my patch bay on the cheap. Okay, I heard that very clearly. All right, there was a huge compounding negative effect when those cables were introduced. But this is how we need to think about it. All right, so you could literally have a 200% improvement in the cabling department with that one example, right? So the point is you can get in there and really make get the insurance policy going for you so that everything is running properly, and then also begin to see the performance of those cables rise. So maybe you have a few good cables, but a lot of cheap cables. We talked about that already. So it's not worth owning the cheap cables. It's important to prioritize your cabling. If you purchase a new piece of gear, think about the cost of cabling to maximize the performance of the gear that you just paid for. That's usually the thing that is like last on the list. We don't even think about it. We just, we buy the gear. Maybe, you might have spent $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 on a piece of gear. And you put in just a generic cable on it, right? Remember, it's the cardiovascular system of being able to get that piece of equipment connected to your recording rig or to your mixing desk or whatever the case might be, whatever you're using. Now, what's also interesting is that digital signal pulses can also be degraded by poor cabling and noise that will affect the transmission or the translation from analog to digital and digital to analog in the process of, those pulses going across the cable. Now, according to audiophile forums, USB cables suffer this the worst. So if you're, let's say, multi-$100 or maybe even in the thousands of dollar USB interface came with a dollar store cable, USB cable, you might want to reconsider it and just bump that up and get something that's of a higher quality, higher manufacture, these types of things that don't carry noise and noise issues. Last thought is this. What about AC cables, power cables? All right. I did not consider this for the longest time. And I decided to test it. And where I tested it first was on my bass rig. My bass rig, I've got a WT, it's a World Tour Eden The thing is heavy, and it is very powerful, and it needs a lot of power. And what I ended up doing is I ended up changing the gauge of the cable from what it came with to a lower number. You know, I think it might have been a 14. It's a 14 gauge cable, like 12 or 14, one of the two. And I heard a massive difference when I gigged with it. The low end, it was punchy. It wasn't puking. It seemed like there was always power. When you're dealing with bass and you're playing bass, you need power on demand. You can't be waiting for power from the wall. Okay. And that's a whole other, I'll probably do a video on different types of power amps when it comes to bass rigs. But the point is that, man, when I changed that cable out, I was like, whoa. And I was getting like more compliments on the cable, or not on the cable, but on the tone, on the tone of the rig. And so I didn't really say anything of what I changed, but it was that simple. It was just that simple. So what I ended up doing, I'm going, now wait a minute, if that's the case, then what about my monitors, any high current drawing piece of equipment in the studio? And I ended up doing that. And again, it made a difference. Because remember, positive compounding variables. In other words, these variables that you basically worked over to get a positive result are going to compound, especially if you have multiples of them. All right? That's exactly what happened here. And so thank you to the audiophile people, because these guys have been talking about this stuff forever. I don't know how many studios I've been in, and all they're doing is they have like one power strip after another power strip, even running high current pieces of equipment, and there's going to be a degradation somewhere. Of course, didn't realize that until I tested it, but I'm just passing this along to you guys. My hope is that it will help. All of these are to help you not be stuck, to help you save money, maybe buy once, cry once, be able to make the best decisions possible within your means, so that as you're moving up in your musical journey and your producing journey and your recording journey, whatever it is that you're doing in music, that you can do those things with confidence, and you're not feeling the pain and discomfort like I did over the years because of my own ignorances. And that's me. That's my own stuff that I'm dealing with here. So again, AC cables make a difference. I think I'm to the end here. So what I'm going to do is let you go. And I appreciate everyone who's watched the video so far. I do appreciate the liking and the subscribing. I appreciate all the comments. Again, I try to respond to those. And I believe that you can get good stuff out of comments and learn things along the way. This is Pete with Wingman Studios. Until next time.